Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and this week we are welcoming in Professor Emeritus from the University of Idaho, maybe other places too, Professor Richard Spence, who I became acquainted to because I was listening to the great courses on the occult, and I'm like, well, that seems like a good topic and a good guy to have on this show. I wonder if I can get him. And I sent him an email, and he said, sure. And I'm like, I must have made a Faustian bargain. So with that little segue in there, thank you very much, Professor Spence, for joining the show.
Well, thanks for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. I mean, firstly, there's a Richard Spencer with an R. It is definitely not the same person for those of you who are being lazy. Also, it is not the same guest that we had on a couple months ago, Robert Spencer, who spoke on Islam. So, also a different person. So, with those little differences that are practically major, but pragmatically, or letter-wise very similar, out of the way, I'm going to let Richard Spence tell us a little bit about himself and then lead us through this journey through the occult.
Okay, so who am I? Well, I think as Jeff mentioned, I'm a professor emeritus, which means I'm retired. It's a fancy way of saying that. I retired in 2020, good timing, from the University of Idaho, where I taught for almost 35 years, which went quickly. Prior to that, I had shorter teaching gigs at Central Washington University and at the place where I got my master's and PhD. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, which does not stand for surfing branch. So yeah, I, for whatever it's worth, whatever it means, and I don't claim that it necessarily means a lot, I have a piece of paper to prove that I am actually a doctor of philosophy in history, which means that I took a lot of courses and spent a lot of time in order to acquire that. You pick up a few things along the way, but I'd certainly say that probably most of what I know or think I know now about many things, I have learned since acquiring that very expensive piece of paper. But it is a start. So yeah, I could talk to a number of things, the horrors of academia or the wonders of it, if you prefer that. So I guess the other question would be is that, well, how did you get interested in something like the occult? I mean, is that what you majored in college? No, there wasn't any way to do that. My academic training the thing that I started out taking lots of coursework in was very broadly modern Eastern European, especially modern Russian history. So when you study modern Russian history, there's no way to get around the Russian Revolution. So when which is kind of a big deal.
Yes.
And when you study revolutions, one of the things that you study, even if you don't realize it, is you're studying conspiracies. Because every revolution, especially successful ones, even unsuccessful ones, have to be conspiratorial. I mean, you don't make revolution without conspiracy, or you will be hanging from a lamppost before the day is out. Because, you're trying to overthrow a government, and generally they will resist that type of thing, so you must conspire. You must be secret. And that's also where things like secret societies, small, selective, oath-bound orders can also become very, very important. So let's just, to give the, as quick as I can, is that when you study the Russian Revolution, one of the things you bump into is secrecy and conspiracy. And it wasn't too long before I kept, bumping into everybody that I seemed to find here was a Freemason. I have to admit that other than the fact that my granddad was a Freemason, and he seemed okay, I'd never really encountered that before. But now I began to run into a lot of them, and I got curious as to why such a relatively small group of people had so many people belonging to this particular brotherhood in it. And by the way, I'm not necessarily implying anything spookily or Luciferian about Freemasons in this case. That's a subject all on its own. But simply to say that when you recruit like-minded people together for one purpose, that can very easily serve another purpose. So, after the lodge meeting and all the Masonic stuff is done, well, let's plot a revolution. And that has happened on more than one occasion. And I also developed an interest in espionage. Who doesn't want to go spy hunting? And one of the things that I found when I began looking into espionage is that it's strange crossover, not just with secret oath-bound societies, fraternal orders of one kind or another, but of specifically occult societies. And I guess one of the questions that might come up with is that what has occultism got to do with espionage? Why would intelligence agencies have any interest in this? And I guess the simple answer to it, although it turns out to be a very complicated one, is that both occultists and spies are obsessed with secrecy. It's all about revealing and concealing the hidden. So there's a certain overlap in mindset and in methodology. That was how, the thing that I'm probably best known for is a book I wrote called Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence in the Occult, which sort of maps out through Crowley's career his connections with British intelligence, perhaps with other intelligence agencies. He was kind of on again, off again, and maybe in the end result, not terribly successful intelligent asset, but he was one. And it was one of those things that he claimed, and nobody, even people who were his fans, much believed. And I didn't, by the way, start investigating that. In fact, I'd say that I don't start investigating anything, or at least so much I try to avoid investigating something with a preconceived opinion. All I knew was that Aleister Crowley had periodically claimed to have worked for British intelligence while in the United States during World War I. And he would mention the names of a couple of people now and then. It was not something very consistent, but again, that was generally just sort of poo-pooed as him making things up. And what I did, actually, while investigating another spy, was I sent off to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., to see whether or not a now defunct intelligence agency called the Military Intelligence Division. So, that's not really... It was sort of like long before the CIA and even really before the FBI. But in World War I, the U.S. had to come up with a kind of national security agency very quickly. So they drafted the Army's intelligence branch into it and expanded it and called it the MID. And then they started collecting dossiers on hundreds of thousands of people, suspected German sympathizers, Bolsheviks, you name it. And then, interestingly, what happened, and what rarely happens with intelligence records, is that all of those records were subsequently declassified. So the MID records in the National Archives are one of the few sort of intelligence troves that, if you're interested, you can really get in and you can search for names and go through it. So I just, wrote off and said, do you have anything on, Aleister Crowley, or to go by his real name, Edward Alexander Crowley. That's a little detail that a lot of people miss. Aleister was never legally ever his name. That was what he called himself. It was his stage name to a certain degree. And sure enough, they did. And it wasn't very big, and it didn't say very much. But what it did say, to summarize the key part, is when the Americans got suspicious of his pro-German activities and thought about arresting him, and they checked with the British consulate in New York, they were told quite clearly that he is in this country, i.e. the United States, on official business of the British government, of which the consulate has full cognizance.
Okay.
So in that sense, Crowley had been telling the truth. He was working for the British government. Now, that leaves a big question unanswered, exactly what he was doing. And for that, you'd have to read the book. We can't spend too much time going in here. But that's the way things are kind of serendipitously discovered. So what you find here is the guy who's generally considered, I think correctly, the arch-occultist of the 20th century. If it isn't Aleister Crowley, I don't know who it is. Was certainly in that period and in other periods of his life an asset, a useful tool, not an intelligence officer, but an intelligence tool or asset for the British, specifically for British naval intelligence, not MI6, but for the Navy.
Oh.
So that's how I got into all of this stuff. And, sometimes to put it very simply, is that one thing leads you to another. The Russian Revolution leads you to conspiracies. Conspiracies lead you to Freemasons. That leads you to occultism. Occultism leads you to Aleister Crowley. And here we are today.
Yeah, I was struck by a bunch of things in listening to the courses, and that is that every movement seemed to be tied to the occult, but so did the counter movement. Whatever they were against, there was also occultism on that side. And then when you boil down into the particular occult groups, there seemed to be sects within the sects, and I'm saying SECTS, again, just to be clear, although sex, SEX, is often part of occultist rituals, or at least implied in there somewhere. But it's, and then to have a secret society, an oath, you have to be bound to some sort of cause. So of course it might be against a movement, some power of the elites, but usually it's elites against elites. So it's sort of this loggerheads physics kind of thing. And then, but when a government's gone, then you have to be against something bigger, a system of government. You have to be against communism. You have to be against capitalism. You have to be against a church, the church. Maybe you have to be against something that's even larger than the church, a particular religion or movement. The cults get bigger. But yeah, I think most people, my generation anyway, got acquainted with occultism probably through the Da Vinci Code and then through the National Treasure movies that I think Disney did. And then, we were told that L'Enfant designed, everything in DC to be aligned to the stars. And then you hear that the pyramids are aligned and like you said, one thing leads to another. And I don't know that it's possible to find out where something started, but I imagine that there were cults since the beginning of people, whether it's in Egypt where you were supposed to worship, Ra or Horus, that there were people who chose to worship Isis, that in Athens, if Athena was your patron god, there are people who chose to worship Dionysus instead. And then in listening to the great courses, which I think I mentioned, it's by the way, it's free on Audible. So I'm not sponsored by Audible, but I can't not recommend it enough, or I can't recommend it enough. I went to the theater, and in there's the theater masks of tragedy and comedy, of course, but then there's horns and there's ghosts. I'm like, oh my God, Dionysus is all over the place. And then where there's faces look a little scary, there's wings, and you're like, wait, that's a scary face. That's not a happy face. What's happening here? And I'm like, oh my, and I've been doing the show for 4.5 years, so I'm sort of looking for those things too, but I wasn't really looking everywhere. And it really is everywhere.
Everywhere. It permeates things. People don't even know what you're engaging in. One of the episodes I have in Secrets of the Occult is about the sort of occult roots of Christmas and Santa Claus. Because now maybe what we need to do here though is a little definition. That's one of the things that often.
Sure.
Yeah, it's one of my pet peeves as an historian, is that people often throw around terms without really ever having defined it. And, one of those, if you go into the political realm, is accusing somebody of being a fascist. All right, now that's never used as a compliment.
No.
Did you notice that? No one ever calls, you call someone a fascist, what you're fundamentally saying in modern political parlance is you don't like them. Okay? They're apparently too far for the right for you. That's something else to always notice. And I'm not taking sides here. I'm just saying that you see constant references to the far right. Have you ever seen somebody described as near right? Wouldn't there have to be a near right? Wouldn't occasionally this is a person of the no, because that's not threatening. Far right is. That just means that they're too right-wing for me. They're scary. So fascist is generally thrown around as a kind of general insult for perceived unpleasant right-wingers. One of the things that people might want to do, if you actually wanted to use that term correctly, would be go to the guy who invented the whole thing, Benito Mussolini. He came up with the whole thing, nobody else, and read his Doctrine of Fascism, where he explains, well, sort of, what fascism is. Now, the problem there is that I defy you to read the Doctrine of Fascism and figure in the kind of, word soup that he comes up with what it is. It's kind of whatever it was that Mussolini thought was cool. It's the whole thing. So the same thing is true with occultism. And occultism is, well, what is it? It's diabolical. Okay, so something which is the occult is inherently diabolical. It's evil. It's spooky. It's scary. Of course, those are the very things that for a lot of people makes it interesting. So what does it actually mean? Well, it's another word with a Latin root, and all that really means is hidden from sight. Hidden, but specifically hidden, something you can't see. The unseen. So another way you could say it in English is to simply say that the occult is the unseen. Well, the unseen what? The unseen world. So the basic premise of occultism, in all its forms, boils down to the idea that the world we live in, the phenomenal world of sight and sound and touch, is only a small part, only a limited spectrum of a much larger world that we can't see and hear and touch, at least not most of the time. But in this greater hidden world, which is a vastly larger domain than what we mere mortals have, there are all kinds of, there are things that live there, and there are powers, and there's a reality, and, maybe there's time, maybe there isn't any time. There's all the cool stuff that we don't have, and what occultism, that is the system of belief of the occult, is how to access and use the intelligences and powers that exist in this hidden world. So occultism is basically a set of tools. It's a kind of how-to manual to access a larger reality. And in that sense, it's basically neutral. It's neither good nor evil nor anything else. It's simply a methodology. But it's a methodology that can employ anything. So it's a methodology that can employ everything from, what are some examples of everyday occult techniques? You hear a lot of people today and before talking about manifesting things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to manifest. This goes back to the whole idea that the way you go in the morning and look in the mirror and give yourself a pep talk. Every day in every way I'm getting better and better. People talk about speaking things into reality. Really, it sounds like if you just clench your teeth and wish really, really hard, you'll get what you want.
Like Stewart from the old Saturday Night Live sketch.
Yeah. You just wish. Well, all of that's pure magical technique. And when it comes to this little term magic, okay, so we need to that's one of the key techniques within occultism. Magic is the kind of let's take Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, I think, came. We always come back to him. His definition of magic, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, and I've said this enough, I should be able to get it down. But what Crowley, his definition of magic, which remember he spelled with a K on the end to differentiate it from trickery,
right,
was that it was the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So you're trying to change something in the reality around you. You're trying to manipulate reality in a direction you want. And you're doing this through the concentration of willpower. There's another term for that, which is mind over matter. Now, you hear that a lot as well. And, Crowley knew his stuff, at least certainly as far as that came. And I think that's it is this attempt in many ways. Magic is a method which is used to alter reality in a direction that you want.
You open up your third eye.
Yeah, you can imagine. Part of it is a degree in imagination. That's what you're doing. You're imagining something, but you're trying to turn what you imagine you're trying to manifest this imaginary thing from an imaginary realm into the physical world, or you're trying to alter reality itself in some subtle way. So the real question there is that, can you do that? Well, some people claim that you can, and I guess anybody who figured out how to do it would probably not tell you exactly how. But it's widely accepted. Again, if you look at all of the self-help manuals, the gurus, everyone else claiming that you can manifest things, you can, if you want to be rich, you just have to imagine yourself rich. That always reminded. I was listening to someone once who was going, well, what you have to do is you have to start dressing and acting like a rich person. You have to take whatever sort of pathetic income you have, and you have to invest that in things that make you look like what you want to be, and then you will become that. You'll sort of draw this type of thing to you. That's magic, my friend. That is the occult in action. But what it reminded me of was an old saying about witchcraft, was that a witch always speaks of things as if they have already happened. So that, again, is the way of sort of projecting your wishes into the sphere of what we think of as reality. So that's certainly a part of it. Every time you engage in wishful thinking, every time you're trying to alter yourself by an application of will, you are engaging in magical occult practices. The other way in which the occult permeates our daily lives is in the form of ritual.
Right.
So my whole episode about Christmas is that Christmas is, it varies from person to person and family to family, but everybody has rituals associated with it. And you don't necessarily even have to understand what the ritual is about in order to partake in it. But ritual is, here again, it comes back to a definition. What's a ritual? A ritual, in the simplest terms, is any series of actions carried out in a precise sequence and manner. Well, what does that describe? Well, I know, it describes a human sacrifice. It also describes high school pep rallies. It describes holidays. It describes plays, symphonies, and motion pictures.
Also parliamentary procedures.
Parliamentary procedure. Okay.
Right. Religious ceremonies.
Are rituals. And rituals, again, are designed to generate, what's the purpose of a high school pep rally? So, you can kind of describe that. What's going on there? Well, you get a bunch of people together and you get them all worked up. You raise their energy, their cone of power within the gymnasium. And what else is going on? Well, you got a bunch of dancing virgins, maybe, but anyway, they're supposed to be. You've got a bunch of dancing girls who are getting the crowd worked up. And you almost inevitably have somebody dancing around in an animal costume as the ritual animalistic totem of the school. And you're chanting things. You get everybody chanting. And what are you chanting? You're chanting for victory. And so you're basically wishing death and destruction upon your opponents. And you're wishing victory and glory upon your team. You are casting a spell, my friends, at a high school pep rally. You're all there together, and the dancing virgins and the animal totem and the spells are being cast for victory. Of course, your opponents are casting spells against that, and I guess, whoever has the better virgins or animal totem or spells is probably the better team is likely to win. But that's what you're doing. That's what all of this stuff is about. So it's all around us in ways that you have to think in some ways that when you go to see a movie, and I think that movies have a particular place in sort of modern popular occultism because there are things going on there at different levels. You have a series of actions carried out in a precise sequence and way, because everything in a movie is plotted out. Nothing's there accidentally. Okay, if an actress walks into a scene wearing a red dress, that has been decided. That's not, it was a really cheap production, maybe not. But in any decently produced film, everything that people are wearing, everything on that soundstage has all been organized. But it's supposed to look ordinary. Now, the other thing that in some way we all realize is that what we're watching are a group of paid performers, actors, saying words that were written by someone else. And what they're doing is that they're creating this whole false reality. Nothing in the film is real. The battles aren't real. The love scenes aren't real, unless they're pornos, in which case they're probably still not real. But it's all fake. It's all pretend. It's all wish manifestation in front of you. But look at what can be done with that. You can create not just a simulacrum of reality of everyday life. You can create entire fantasy worlds and environments. And all of this is ostensibly for the purpose of entertainment, but you're actually participating into a kind of, once again, everybody sitting in that audience, or most of them, are there, and you're engaging in a kind of self-hypnosis. It's called willing suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know that none of this is real, and yet you react to it as real, not simply because it's convincing, but because you have decided in that point in time to accept it as real. It becomes, for those 2 or 2.5 or, what's it told the movie, 3.5 hours, as the reality that you have. So yes, we live immersed in an occult world every day, and in virtually everything that we do.
Except a lot of that is not hidden. It's
just not acknowledged as such.
Right. That's right. It's funny because the word cult is, you think that's more hidden, but I guess the difference is that they are upfront and out there. But they too have their, often is a spin-off from something that might be a cult. Anyway, I think getting caught up in the similarity between occult and cult and the roots of the words is probably not beneficial.
Yeah, they're really distinct. One is included in the other, but occult is hidden from sight.
Right.
Occultus. Cult, well, that gets kind of tricky. Again, cult is something is often used, like the term fascism is used. It's used to denigrate a fringe religious group you don't like.
Right.
Because you would never call. Let's put it this way, and I'm not going to, just because they're so easy to pick on. Roman Catholic Church. All right, the Roman Catholic Church, venerable institution. But let's face it, if the Roman Catholic Church, instead of being, I don't know, a billion-strong religion across the world, if it was a relatively small group of people under some strange guy who called himself the Pope in Escondido, California, we would have no problem calling it a cult. I mean, look at the stuff that they believe in. Look at the things that they do. Those are all could easily be described as cult-like activities, and this guy's supposed to be infallible. Well, that certainly sounds cult-like in that regard.
Sure. Well, God's representative on earth is,
Yes.
that's as old as pharaohs, are probably older than pharaohs.
There's a distinction. You can always be asked, what's the difference between a cult and a religion? And I'm not endorsing this view, but I think it's kind of food for thought in this case. And the most provocative way that distinction was ever made to me was that in a religion, in a cult, there's always someone at or near the top who knows it's a con. In a religion, that person is dead.
Okay.
So that's certainly worth contemplating in some circumstances, or that religions or cults that became popular enough that it then became difficult to describe them as cults.
That one's probably more likely.
Yeah.
I mean, there is something towards the cutting you off from your friends and family kind of thing in a cult that isn't necessarily part of most religions, but I can't even say that with absolute certainty either. Especially if you are a new convert or someone being converted.
There's usually, it varies. There's usually pressure. Let's say if half of a couple joins a church and their significant other does not, there will be some degree of pressure to try to bring that person into the fold.
Yes.
Most churches will be content with one convert. They'd rather have two, but one's okay. But in other cases, it was, I can certainly think of one case of someone I knew fairly well, and in this case, the wife joined a church and her husband was not interested in it. And she was told by the pastor of the church that she could not remain married to him if he wouldn't, come to Jesus. That was it. If he wasn't going to do that, then there was no way that she could remain married to him. So she was presented with this choice to either preserve her marriage or to save her soul, as it was put. This was the argument that they had. That ended in breaking up the marriage.
Right.
And for a time, they eventually got back together. So you enter into a very, in some cases, the more you try to define something, the more difficult it is to clearly define. The distinctions, let's put it this way, the distinctions between cult and religion, which are largely a matter of how weird they're perceived as being, and how small they may be. There's also an element in cults. One of the things to look for is something called excessive devotion. And excessive devotion is usually directed towards the leader of the cult, and there's always one of those. There's no cult without a leader.
Right.
And this is where you get that you would have absolute, unquestioning devotion to this person, and you do everything that they say. Again, I can also say from personal experience that when I was in grad school in Santa Barbara, there was, and there may still be, and I'll give them their name, a cult, because they were termed a cult, more occultish religious group that you would find, called the Brotherhood of the Sun. I think there were different names to it than that, and this included all kinds of stuff. There were things about Lemurians living on the Channel Islands and all kinds of stuff that sounded, kind of improbable. But one of the things that people who joined this did was that you turned over all of your worldly possessions to the church, which basically meant to the guy running it.
Right.
I mean, you just sort of get, if you had a trust fund, that all became the church. And he would do things like buy a yacht. So he's taking their money. He's sailing around on a yacht, like he's L. Ron Hubbard.
Wow.
That. And in the meantime, they're all working in the various cult businesses, supermarkets, restaurants. If they're being paid at all, it's virtually nothing. Or they're slaving away on one of its farms up in the hill, where their leader is also declaring that they need to store arms for the apocalypse. There's always an apocalypse that's going to happen in this case. So I actually knew someone who joined this and turned their whole life over to it. And the only thing I could think to say to them, and I'd say the same thing to the day, is that what the hell is the matter with you? I mean, have you lost your mind? Because that's what it appeared, is that they had just simply lost all sense of proportion, that they just, they gone crazy. And now they were doing crazy things. They, of course, did not see it that way. I was being blind and obstinate, and sure enough, I was rather quickly cut off because I couldn't ask them what the hell is the matter with you and hang out with them anymore.
Right.
So there was a powerful means to affect people's psyches, to affect their whole lives, but what they were being promised, the whole payoff in this, other than the fact that they were going to survive the apocalypse where other people weren't. So that's a very sort of popular idea, that we're going to be the only ones saved. Everybody else is going to hell. Everyone else is going to die. And, ultimately, you're kind of hoping that everybody else dies, aren't you? Because that, you need that to kind of justify what you're doing in this case. So never underestimate the power of belief or psychosis, whichever that may be.
Well, everybody likes to belong to something larger themselves and think that they have knowledge that very few or no one else has, that they're a part of a secret club. Do we have any idea, and we, of course, means you and whoever you work with and came across, what is the earliest example of something that would have been considered a cult that didn't make it into a religion that we might still recognize? I imagine the most cults are short-lived, 1 or 2 generations, maybe 3, but the ones that, that occupy our minds, like the Templars and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and whatever, those are either they're more recent or that they've seemed to survive in some way or form for, decades, centuries, maybe in some cases millennia.
Well, what do I think is one of the earliest evidences of occult beliefs?
Yeah, sure.
And there might be a group behind it. Cave paintings.
Okay.
Because what you tend to find, again, I think somewhere in the series I mentioned one of these, but they're all pretty. You go down. People didn't actually live in these caves, so where you find paintings, people didn't live there. They weren't decorating their living rooms.
Right.
So someone had to go to a good deal of trouble. I mean, you got to imagine what this entails. At the best, you're going to have like a lamp made out of animal fat. And you're going to be negotiating deep, dark, treacherous caverns. And you're going down into these deep areas underground where, again, you don't live, you don't do anything else there. And then in this semi-dark environment, you're going to start painting pictures on the wall. So again, this isn't artwork for, if you wanted to show people this, you'd do it outside in the light. But instead, you're doing it underground in the dark. So the assumption, even in the early people who looked at these paintings, that they had some kind of ritual purpose. So they're painting animals on the wall, and this must have been some sort of magic, some sort of projection of trying to, in this case, not speak, but paint into reality what you wanted. Here's this big fat bison. This is what it was we need to survive. Now, why you think you have to do that underground in the dark still mystifies me. So, but in some way, this had to be hidden. In other words, this artwork is being what? It's being occulted. It's being deliberately hidden from sight. We could guess because in some way that was assumed to increase its power. The other thing you'll notice that you seldom, if ever, see in any kind of early painting, and and the artist in this case has skills. They can paint the animals with great realism, astounding in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
But what you don't see is they never paint themselves. There's not a single human portrait anywhere to be found among them. No one ever paints the face of themselves or anyone else. They don't do portraits. The most that human figures will show up is they're sort of stick figures in some way. Now, again, this isn't accidental. They're doing this deliberately. They have the skills to portray human beings, to portray human figures in great and realistic detail, and they deliberately do not, in the same way that they deliberately portray animals in that way. So you'd have to suspect the only seeming answer to it is they don't portray humans because that's taboo in some way. That would be too real, that you're trying to do something, you're trying to magically manipulate through portrayal the animals, but you don't really dare do that with humans because that can get too close. That gets kind of cross a line in this case.
Well, some of that survives. I mean, I guess, to overly simplify things, you sort of have your holy trinity of, the origin story, and a lot of the origin stories of some, what we call First Nations peoples are saying, but, all First Nations people started in Asia, and at some point we all came out of Africa. So, some of the stories probably are way, way older and, similar. And somebody came from the stars. They did what they had to do here. A lot of times they made something wrong first, evil giants, whatever. There was a flood or a fire to vanquish them. They started over with humans and taught us agriculture and this, that, and the other thing, and then went underground. And at some point, there was sort of like a hero or a storm guard, war guard, fertility god who defeated, the primordial sea in the form of a serpent or a dragon. So, you sort of have your three major unknowns: the skies, the deep sea, and underground. And so maybe it makes sense in that the veneration was sort of the closest they could get to the underground. The underworld was they'd make their paintings there and then sort of scurry out once, and it was like a sacrifice without a sacrifice. I mean, you did your veneration, you did your penance, they'd see it, they'd know that you worship them. But as far as the part that survived, I mean, in the older parts of the Bible, you could never see the face of God. It was too bright, too fearsome to see it. I mean, now we have depictions of God all over the place. I mean, part of, modern Christianity is Jesus everywhere. But, in Islam, it survived. You can't even make a depiction of Muhammad without committing, a crime. And maybe that goes back all the way to whatever the first religions were, whenever humans had that kind of sentience, whether it's 300,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. I mean, maybe some of those ancient roots have stayed with us in our DNA this entire time.
Yeah, there's a real hinkiness about images somewhere. I mean, you found that Islam, doesn't just ban the portrayals of Allah and the Prophet in this case. Any kind of image of living things, even animals, are suspect. And I think part of that, and you can find an element of this in, one place you can find it is in the Jewish tradition of the golem. And the golem is a statue brought to life. So it's a man made of clay. It's a simulacrum of God's creation of Adam.
Right. Ancient Frankenstein.
It's just a bunch of clay, but with the right incantations. with the right words written and spoken and placed within its mouth, it becomes alive, and it will then do it's the earliest version of Frankenstein, actually. And then you can be sent out to destroy your enemies, and then inevitably it gets out of control, and then you have to get rid of it in that way. But there's that can come from a lot of things. One is that humans have the artistic talent, not all of us, but some of us do, to create amazingly realistic portrayals of living things, including people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you'll see, the story of Pygmalion, okay, it's a statue of an ideal woman, and eventually the gods bring it to life for him. Because that would be this question you would have. This thing looks so lifelike. And in that case, it's worth noting that among the Greeks, when they created lifelike human statues, they painted them to look even more lifelike. These were not, marble portrayals. These were painted to look as if they were as real as possible. So what you've done here is that you do have this, it's as close as you can get to the creation of actual living things. It's just like one little step further, one little thing more, one more wish to be fulfilled, and you can take this image and you can turn it into an actual living being. And that can be scary. Sometimes things are too, or you have the same sort of prohibition in some places against taking photographs of people. There are people, I've known people who, as far as I know, don't have any particularly weird beliefs, who don't like having their pictures taken.
Right.
This is hard to believe today in the realm of the selfie. Clearly, most people do not. But other people don't. They don't really like that in some way, and it's seen as a kind of theft of the image. And that if you have the image of a person, to some degree, you have that person, and you can manipulate it for other purposes. So the creation of graven images of any kind, voodoo dolls fall into the very create an image of the person, and then in some way you can access it, you can manipulate it through them.
Well, that's when idols went to idolatry.
Yeah, it's a way of envisioning something. An idol could be, in most cases, they weren't viewed as the deity themselves. They were viewed as a focus of adoration. But the focus of adoration, with people coming in, and remember, often making prayers before this, it's the same thing with the saints in the church. You're praying to the saint, and and you have thousands of people doing this every day for centuries. And of these prayers, of these wishes, what are prayers? They are wishes. Wishes are being projected, and they are being projected towards this image of this saint or of this god or goddess, which you want to be real. This must exist because they have to be real in order to fulfill your wishes. And one of the things that, occult speculation might argue is how long can that go on before you begin to get some sort of effect? How long can you treat something as being alive and you can invest it with intention? To what degree do the supplicant's intentions, can they become manifested in some sort of conscious form? There's a term for that in occultism. It's called the egregore, a thought form that people can collectively create a kind of being which is an aggregate of their own thoughts, desires, wishes, hatreds, whatever it may be. And that this can become like a computer program, or like AI, self-aware, and then begin. This is why I think that AI itself is an entirely occult concept. Look what you're trying to do.
Well,
you're trying to create an artificial life.
But the thing that strikes me, or one of the things that strikes me right now, is that at some point the occult was more towards the spiritual, but there was always a cult that was dealing with we know this numerology or this special code or this special way of doing things. Alchemy was illegal, and Galileo was burned at the stake and all of this stuff. But at some point, the occult and science sort of joined together, merged in that Frankenstein way. And now we have like Max Headroom, HAL, Ultron, Terminator, whatever you want to say. But I mean, it's sort of the Golem, but if you're particularly religious, it's not much different than the Tower of Babel, other than the Babel actually babbles back at you, and has arms and legs, so it's always man trying to play God, and if you're religious, God strikes back. If you're in the group that wants you to do this, this is God's will, and then if you're secular, you're like, no, this is progress. And I'm sure that there's dozens of permutations of all of that out there as well. But I don't know if that's just me rambling or if there's a cohesive thought that you can pick up on the thread.
People would ask, what's the difference between, the roots of modern chemistry as a science rest firmly in alchemy, which was an occult science.
Right.
Alchemy is the magic of things. It's the manipulation of physical matter to turn one thing into another. That is, to cause change to occur in conformity with will through various practices. Most of it just has to do with heating things up and mixing them together. That's chemistry. Modern chemistry is alchemy without magical intent. It is purely the mechanics without the intent, because that's what, in every kind of magical action, whether again it's some sort of self-affirmation, whether it's a ritual, whatever it is, the key element here is the intent. There's something that you want, and you have this intent. That's the will that Crowley's talking about. To cause change in conformity with will is to have an intent of what it is you want to happen. And that intent can be good, it can be bad, it can be, the intent can be for you to get better, the intent can be for someone to die. It doesn't really, again, the mechanisms themselves can be used for any sort of purpose. And it's, that's always there, and I think it's the intent that's one of those things that you have to be careful of, because intents do have a way, even if you want to think of it out of intent. If you begin to focus on something long enough, intents have a way of manifesting themselves, one way or the other.
Well, it's interesting that you say this, because every practitioner of magic I have ever spoken to said there's not dark magic, there's not light magic, there's just magic. It's how you approach it, how you manifest it, that makes it dark or light or good or bad or, whatever you want to phrase it, but it's exactly that concept.
Well, there was a film that was done a few years ago called The Witch. I don't know if you ever saw
Oh,
that.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, okay. It's a period piece set in New England. And, people either love it or hate it. I liked it, but there's a scene in it. One of the characters in this, without going through the whole movie, is a large goat called Black Phillip, which you kind of suspect there's something odd about the goat.
Yeah, right on the head.
And, yes, and towards the end of it, after a lot of very bad things have gone down, our protagonist, a young woman named Tamsin, is sort of alone, and she's alone with Black Phillip, and she knew that her little siblings claimed that they could talk to the goat, and it could talk to them. And so eventually, I think with nothing else to go, she goes, can you understand me? Can you understand this? And then one of the things that the goat says is, what do you want?
Who does the Grail serve?
That's the question in this. What do you want? And her response to that is, what can you offer? Because there are a whole sort of litany of things that can be offered, and if you just put your signature in this book and I'll guide your hand, the deal is done. And that is, that's the Faustian bargain right there. And it's one of the things that would be commonly encountered in this. If you believe that there are any, intelligences in our universe other than we humans, then, and you would run into them, that's one of the things that you will be asked. What do you want? What kind of deal can we make? Now, keep in mind, they want something, but they want to find out what it is that you want under those circumstances. I would suggest that if faced with that, beware. It will probably not work to your advantage in the long run. But in the short time, you can have something of that kind. But I thought that scene was particularly well done, because you could almost sort of see the wheel. Again, this is a film; it's all a ritual being played out for us. This is all plotted out. Trying to figure out what her options were, and at this point, the options was, probably to make some sort of deal with Black Phillip.
So it seemed, yeah. And of course, there's twins. And I watched the movie a few times to try to convince myself, or to figure out whether it was in her head or wasn't. And it obviously wasn't. And I realized things that I didn't. One, you're in the world of Puritans, and this guy was too extreme to be in the Puritans that he's cast off. The other thing is he mentioned a few times that, most people have all of their children die. They haven't lost any. I think the dad at some point made a deal with what turned out to be the devil. Probably he didn't think it was. And it was, the sins were bestowed on the next generation of his family out there closer to the woods, to the wilderness. But anyway, that's I guess a review of The Witches and what we were going to do there. But I do love that movie, and then there's certainly that stuff in there. But yeah, alchemy is very interesting in that it sort of lives within that that Templar assassins, Hashashins kind of cult. The whole treasure of Solomon and the Holy Land and all that Da Vinci Code lore, the Grail and all that, and the same question that Black Phillip asks is basically the question the Grail asked Parsifal: who does the Grail serve? And Parsifal didn't give the right answer the first time, or however the story goes. But I suppose if he said, "I want you to serve me," then maybe all of a sudden Parsifal would be remembered as Faust, instead of some savior of a future Arthur. I know that there was a cult of Isis, and it still persists today. Which, I mean, if I'm right, that probably means you have a cult that is, probably 4,000 or 5,000 years old.
Well, the cult of Isis, there's some who would argue that the cult of Isis survives in the Roman Catholic Church as the cult of Mary.
Well, yeah, that's what.
And some of the symbolism is still there. Right?
Can we not just can we tie that? Can we make that leap? I mean, obviously, I know exactly what you're talking about, but the audience probably doesn't.
Well, what would be the similarities between them? Well, female goddess is part of it. If you look at a common portrayals of Virgin Mary, she's often standing on a kind of crescent, kind of half moon looking thing. And that's been interpreted in a lot of ways. In the Middle Ages, it was interpreted as her standing on a symbol of Islam, and some sort of trampling upon the moon of Islam. Well, it goes back before Islam ever existed. What it is essentially identical with, if you look at images of Isis, is it's Isis's solar boat. Mm-hmm. that she is riding across the sky. I'd say the simplest thing, if people are curious of that, go back and look at images, look at the iconography of Isis, and look at the iconography as it evolves over time of the Virgin Mary. And there are similar elements. I mean, stuff has been borrowed at the very least. That's not too strange because people constantly recycle things. So I think that, one cannot insist that the cult of the Virgin Mary is literally a Christianization of the cult of Isis, but it certainly embodies many of the same symbols and much of the same iconography. Maybe that was simply borrowed and brought into it. And yet, the saint, the deity, however we want to describe it, does much the same type of thing. She is a kind of female savior goddess. She is, Isis is the mother of Horus. It's who is in some ways the recreation of his father Osiris, who was killed, in which he mourns. You can even find a similarity in the blue cloak that Mary always wears, often with stars on it, is part of this as well. It's, at the very least, someone is magically or occultly embedding these things. There's a crossover between them. And that's another thing you tend to find about occult symbolism and methodology, is that it's infinitely adaptable. It can adapt itself to anything.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Okay. In some ways, it's almost as if someone is saying, it doesn't really matter what humans, you can get them to believe, and you can tell them a story and they'll believe it. And that's, that's something else that permeates this, is a great deal of, remember, charlatanism and trickery.
Absolutely.
It's why Crowley wanted to make that distinction about what he considered to be real magic and fake magic. And he was quite well versed in fake magic as well. He was arguably a fairly good stage magician on his own. But keep in mind, what a stage magician does is that, and we accept this generally, there's this willing suspension of disbelief. You go in, you know that a stage magician is faking it. You know this is a trick. But his job is to perform a trick in such a way that you can't actually see the trick. And this is astounding because it appears to be real. That is, he creates the simulacrum of reality, which is to some degree forced to accept because we can't really define how he did this. But it's all a trick. Now, one of the ways that I think Crowley would explain that is that from the magician's standpoint, even from an occult practitioner standpoint, the trick is a lot easier than the real thing, because the trick is something that you can practice, and once you get it down, it works virtually every time. There's no guessing game in it. Now, on the other hand, if you got to go summon a demon to help you with something, those things, that gets tricky because they tend to be kind of ornery and, deceitful and resentful. You got to draw your magic circles in the right way or bad things will happen. So what's easier? What's simply the least expenditure of energy? Do you actually want to invoke the aid of immaterial beings in performing this? Or do you just want to perform a trick, the results of which are indistinguishable to the audience? And see, this is one of the things that we should all keep in mind about what we see everywhere in everyday reality. How much of what we're looking at is real, and how much of what we're looking at is a trick made to look like reality.
Well, what a great cult if you are engaging in rituals to fend off something that's unpleasant, and you're going to be saved upon death, and that unpleasantness, the end that's nigh, never materializes, and you die. Hopefully you go to a better place, or just everything goes black and you don't know any better. Your worldview was a success. You have fended off the end of being nigh, and you've been saved or rapture. I do love the sort of part of the occult and larger beliefs also, where we're going to be saved by these people, whether it's the aliens or the deities or the gods or fae folk or whatever, and we're going to be part of their inner core. But almost always an occult group is against some other, it's like S.H.I.E.L.D. has a Hydra. G.I. Joe had Cobra. There's always the other side. The Jedis had the Sith. Whatever it is. So you're going against them, and and they are the elites. The elites are bad, but you're going to be in this small finite group that's going to be leading the flock, or the 144,000 witnesses, which has now been translated into because there's 8 billion of us. It's not just 144,000 are going to survive. They're going to be the ones that maintain God's will on in paradise. which sounds like you're just creating a much smaller class of elites to me, but what do I know?
Well, yeah, power passes to the hands of elites, one elite to another. And I remember I was on one. It wasn't anything discussion of the occult, but I remember one interview that I did, and it was sort of a call-in thing, and someone was talking about we have to get back our freedoms. We have to get back being free, and I don't know. My response to that was, when have you ever been free?
Yeah.
When were human beings free? When didn't we have masters in one form or another? When was there always someone who was eating better and living better than everybody else, who was telling us that it was our job to keep them well fed and the rest of this, and we all went along with it? Okay, you get suckered into this. Okay, it's a if you look at most civilizations, they're Ponzi schemes. There's the pharaoh and the priests who are telling you that the pharaoh is a living god, and all of them they're not growing any food and they're not producing anything, but we're looking out for your soul, so you'll go into the afterlife in the meantime. In other words, work harder, little people, and everybody does. And I don't want to say that civilization is a con, but could be.
Yeah, it's a little bit, and it's been a pretty successful one. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying that this is usually in relationship to climate change, saying they want to get rid of the carbon, and you are the carbon. They want to get rid of you. I'm like, well, if that's the case, they're doing a pretty bad job, because we just crossed 8.1 billion people, and I'm old enough to remember in my lifetime when the population of the Earth was 4 billion, and I'm not that old. I'm 55. And people saying, we're going towards a one-world government. Well, are we? There's now at least 195 recognized countries. That's I think something like 100 years ago, there were like 90. So we're doing a pretty bad job of making a one-world government. They want us to have one religion. Well, maybe they should have stopped at the 34,000th, denomination of Christianity instead of 35,000th, and then had a few more religions start after that. It's just like you're saying. Yours is, when have we ever been free? I mean, I guess if you were if you were going to the Oklahoma land rush, you might have felt free, but you also were probably getting smallpox. You were probably being harried by bandits and outlaws, and probably by people who thought that you were on their land as well. And you were free to take an outlaw's bullet in the back. You were free to have your wagon wheel break and your horses go lame on you, and you're free to get arrows in the gut on the way as well, without any government impediments.
And if everything goes perfectly well and you get your farm and it's prosperous, the sheriff's going to show up to collect taxes.
Right.
Okay. And you're going to pay that, or they're going to take it and sell your farm.
Right.
So
until we invent the next Ponzi scheme, which is credit.
It's that was the greatest. That's got to be the greatest thing since sliced bread coming along. We'll advance you money. There you go, and you'll pay interest on it. Yeah, it's human beings are quarrelsome creatures for the moment. But it's just hard to figure out. I mean, you're 55. I'm pushing 73. So, and I would have to say that when I was 17, people seemed to make a lot more sense than they do now. All right, I will just offer this: that over the period of time, I do not understand human beings. I understand them less now than I understand the fact that you really can't understand them. And what it basically comes down to is that people tend to be polite. They tend to be nice until, for some reason, they're not. All right. Well, I mean, most people are nice most of the time. You encounter people every day. It's okay. There's no real problem. There's an occasional crazy in the subway or something else. But anyone who is nice and cooperative can, and seemingly for no particular reason you can often figure out, can just turn on a dime. And I think it was, the man who always had something to say about everything, Winston Churchill, said something to the effect that we're all mad about something. He didn't mean angry; he meant crazy. And
Right.
There's some little thing, you'll get onto some subject, you'll find something, and someone is, they're mad about this. And that's the one thing in which they cease to be reasonable in that way. And you can look at that in one of two ways. It's either the curse of humanity, which it is in some respects, that we just can't really get along in the long run, or in other respects you can argue it's a kind of blessing in a way, because it also means that we're very, very difficult to control, and what works on most never works on all.
Well, nature seeks balance.
Yeah, it's well, there's always the mutant. There's always the mutant which is thrown up, the person who will not, everybody else goes along with the con, but there are going to be a few who are going to see the con. Okay, maybe you'll catch them and hang them really quickly, or maybe they'll start a whole movement and overthrow that con and create their new con, like the Bolsheviks. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
And Rasputin, who the warrior monk who was neither warrior nor monk.
Okay, it's a. I'm working on a series now for the Great Courses, which is great villains of history, and some of them are, and essentially they're just people who've generally, at one degree or another, been described as bad guys.
Right.
Okay, because villain is basically a literary creation. A villain is ultimately just the opponent, the person who opposes the hero. So, and one of those, and I picked some who were, obviously pretty villainous, but others you find, Rasputin is, he's really not such a bad guy. He actually gave the Tsar pretty good advice, which was stay out of the war.
Right.
This will be a disaster. So had Nicholas actually did what Rasputin told him to do, which he didn't, so he didn't have that much influence, things would have worked out much better in the long run. He was a con man. He was taking advantage of the Tsarina. He was probably a kind of, cut-rate hypnotist, and he was a traveling faith healer. That's what he was. That was his great villainy, I suppose. But other than that, he gave pretty decent advice, and he wasn't involved in all, he certainly wasn't some sort of shape-shifting, extra-dimensional minister of evil that is portrayed in assorted films. But, that looks better on screen.
Well, every Camelot wants its Merlin to sort of authenticate it. You want your wise wizard man on your side. And I guess you don't get to be called the Great if you stay out of wars. I mean, that's one of the strange lessons of human history, is that we think of people as the great who did something to expand their world, not condense it.
Well, you got to win. It's the one thing. You can get involved in wars, but you got to win. Otherwise, you just become one of history's new or the losers.
Yeah. You don't even get to be called Peter the Pretty Good at that point.
Peter the So-So.
Yeah.
No, I mean, Peter the Great. Now, there's a guy for you. I mean, he was unpleasant. So, I mean, in another episode of the same thing, a villain I bring, who I think is truly villainous, was Henry VIII, which is, I mean, the guy is just a louse.
Yeah.
There's virtually nothing good you can say about him, other than the fact that he was, like a lot of villains or sociopaths, he was charming. Okay. That should be something that you should always be vaguely suspicious of.
Yeah. I mean,
people who are charming.
Yeah, he changed the entire religion of an entire country, basically, so that he could marry a younger, prettier woman, I guess, under the pretense of having, maybe not the pretense of having a male heir, right? I guess. But
he wanted a male heir. He also wanted the teenage girl.
But didn't
she's not actually a teenager at that point, but she's younger than. Yes, there was that. He wanted to have sex with a younger, prettier female. Well, that's odd. And the whole male heir thing comes into it, but he was just pretty much an ass through.
And Epstein Island was not available at the time.
No, it was. There you go. Henry VIII brought back from the dead, goes to Epstein's Island.
There you go.
An episode of something.
It certainly is. You've been very generous with your time. I think initially we said an hour. We're going on 75 minutes. I don't know how your back is doing, but mine starts to get cranky around this time.
I could go a little while longer, but not much. I mean, yeah.
Okay, so then I'm gonna accept that, but I'll make you an offer, and hopefully you'll accept. Is that maybe you'll come back and we can like spend some time on some particular aspects of the occult, so we can sort of do deep dives into either certain people or things, and that way, because I'd love to hear about Helen of Blavatsky, but I'm sure that she is a whole story. I'd love to talk about Rudolf Steiner, but he's a whole real story. I'd also like to hear, who are the Rosicrucians? What's your take on the Freemasons, and why are they so important other than they build stuff? And what's the difference between a Freemason and a Mason, other than that I guess one only builds stuff and the other is led upon the secret, secrets of the world. So instead of keeping you longer, I'd rather beg your indulgence to keep you longer, but at different times.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, I appreciate that. That is wonderful. But was there anything that you wanted to say? Is there anything that you want to promote? Do you want to be found and followed? I know that you mentioned the book that you had written. Do you want to? Is there anything that you have to?
Well, I can. I've written a number of books, some of which are still available, and some of which are not. The Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, is again by far the most popular thing. I didn't plan it that way, but that's just the way it worked out. Also, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, if you want to really sort of get into some interesting nitty-gritty, particularly economic shenanigans and conspiracy involved with that, you can check that out. That's available. I wrote a biography of Sidney Riley, a spy, Freemason, by the way, along with a number of other things. That's called Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley. That is, alas, recently out of print, and I might end up reissuing it or not. I don't know. I'd rather rewrite the entire thing. But and then, of course, there's the work that I've done more recently for the Great Courses, which is eminently accessible through the Great Courses and in Audible format and on streaming on demand. And if you have Amazon Prime, you can actually find those. And those are the 24-episode Real History of Secret Societies, which covers things like Rosicrucians, Freemasons, etc. And then Crimes of the Century, a set of historical murders, some more grisly than others. And then, of course, most recently, Secrets of the Occult, forthcoming in a year or so, Great Villains of History. I also appear in a couple of the Great Courses. It's also called Wondrium, the Secrets of Espionage, and also the sort of, I think it's Forensic History, decoding some murders as well. You can find me there. I am, with some reluctance, contemplating doing a podcast with a friend of mine. Now, everybody in the world seems to have a podcast.
Yes, they do.
And I have long wondered whether it really needs another one. But we may try that out. And if we do, it will be called Strange as It Seems. And it will cover a whole variety of things. They all have to be strange. So that leaves things fairly wide open.
Excellent.
And, so that's kind of what I'm up to now.
That's a lot.
It's enough.
It's enough. Exactly. All right, and now you've just agreed to one more. So, but I guess it's probably practice for all of the others. So, so that works. That's my pitch.
It would be my pleasure. I like talking about these things. So, I have to.
It is true.
This is, as your audience knows, there's no money being exchanged here.
No.
So, obviously, it's just vanity on my part or something of that kind.
Listen, that is as pure motivation as there is. Okay. Yes. This is Professor Richard B. Spence, Professor Emeritus from University of Idaho. He's told you about some other things. Thank you so much. And audience, you now learned that you could consume him in many ways in the present and in the future, possibly even a podcast of his own. But if nothing else, you can certainly look forward to hearing him again on this podcast. And as the audience knows, but you don't know, Professor, is I try not to gouge any of my guests and have them on too often, too proximately. So I won't be looking to, we'll talk about like 4 or 5 month increments.
I await the summons at your pleasure.
Excellent. I love someone awaiting my summons. I shall send my raven henceforth. All right. Thanks very much for everyone for listening. Check out his stuff, and you can give him ratings and review. There are ratings and review on Audible. Trust me, I see them all the time, and I even do with them sometimes. And we get ratings and review too, and we would appreciate that just as much as I'm sure the professor would. Maybe even more, because I'm not a professor. So thanks for listening. Thanks for your indulgence, and you'll hear from us next week on Garden of Doom, and who knows, maybe midweek on Garden Views.